23 years and 2 minutes since the South Tower was hit at the World Trade Center. 23 years and 2 minutes, exactly. 9:03 Eastern Time is when the South Tower was hit. And right now, they are reading off names in New York City on the 23rd anniversary of September 11th. So last night was the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And I thought there were opportunities, not where the moderators were going to do it, but where Donald Trump might bring up September 11th. Might bring up the fact that today is 23 years to the day since we lost thousands of Americans in the worst terrorist attack in American history. And there is a way to weave this all together. And you do it through the border. Let's go back to 23 years ago. And let's go back to how these terrorists, and there were 19 of them on this day 19 years ago. 19 men affiliated with Al-Qaeda who hailed from 4 different countries: Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Lebanon. And they got into this country through fake passports. And they cobbled together their plan that killed thousands of Americans and put this country under attack. Fast forward 23 years later, and we found out over the summer, according to a report from the House Judiciary Committee, that more than 250 migrants on the terrorist watch list entered the United States illegally at the southern border during the fiscal years of 2021, 2022, and 2023. And at least 99 of those 250 have been allowed to enter and settle in the United States. Along with those 99, 34 other illegal immigrants on the watch list were in Department of Homeland Security custody, but not fully removed from the United States. You know, we sit here and we say, never forget. We use our hashtags. People post their things on social media. But we clearly have forgotten. It's indisputable. It makes for a cute hashtag. But that's all it is at this point for tens of millions of Americans. You can't possibly square voting for Kamala Harris with the idea of never forget. It's impossible to do. Because Kamala Harris, as Joe Biden's number 2, has overseen the most porous border in American history, where you have had drug dealers, you have had criminals, you have sexual abusers, and yes, you do have terrorists who want to kill Americans who have entered this country across the wide open southern border. That's not hyperbolic. That's not opinion. That's fact. So anybody who's telling you that they're never forgetting is full of it. You can't square those two things at the same time. It's impossible to do. You can't possibly sit there and say, boy, we better make sure we never have another 9/11, and somehow turn a blind eye to what's going on and what has gone on for 3.5 years along the southern border. What's happened at the southern border is worse than anybody could have ever imagined. And I would have not predicted this back in January of 2021 as Joe Biden was set to take office. And then there was last night. It would have been nice if Donald Trump brought that up. It would have been very appropriate on the eve of September 11th. But as we've talked about for 2 hours, Trump didn't do himself a lot of favors. He didn't lose the election or anything like that, but he didn't do himself any favors because he kept stepping on his own foot, for lack of a better word. But Kamala Harris also had a moment that Trump needed to jump on. January 6th came up last night. Of course, right? Can you believe it?
Talk about a bombshell.
I know. David Muir and the ABC hacks, of course. You know, why talk about more kitchen table issues when you can talk about January 6th? And Kamala Harris said one of the things that got massively overlooked And to say this on the eve of September 11th is an insult to every American who remembers where they were and that moment 23 years ago.
Donald Trump left us the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War.
There's a lot of things that have happened between the Civil War and January 6th. And January 6th was an embarrassment. Maybe you weren't listening to this show on January 7th because we weren't yet on 95.7 FM where this audience has exploded. But I was as critical as anybody of what happened that day, the embarrassment that it was, and how it should have never happened. And there's no excuse making for it. But I'll tell you right now, on the eve of September 11th, to talk about that being the greatest attack on democracy since the Civil War, I don't know who gave her that line because we all know Kamala Harris was wildly rehearsed last night, but that is an insult to any common sense, decent American who does remember where they were 23 years ago. I do. I was a 13-year-old kid living 15 miles outside of Manhattan, New York, as the crow flies, who had a father who was in Midtown Manhattan that day. My wife, Kate, she was 14 years old, out on Long Island. She had a father who was supposed to be in the World Trade Center that day for a job interview that he didn't end up going to. And most of the guys that he was supposed to interview with lost their lives that day. And we all have our own stories. We all have our own remember where you were moments. It's impossible not to. But let's not forget, 23 years is a long time. There are people voting now who are not alive when that happened. To them, it's like a moment in history, right? It's something that happened before they were born. Maybe for some of you, it's like Pearl Harbor. And they don't realize, and it's not their fault, but listen, there's just context that you don't have when something happened before you were alive. You don't remember it. You're not alive for it, right? You just can't have the context that you can have when you were alive. But when you look back on that day and you say, how do we make sure that never happens again? Well, one of the obvious ways to do it, the simplest ways to do it, is to make sure that you're doing everything in your power to keep people who want to kill us out of the country. And this administration has failed 12 million times on that issue. And they have not been called out properly for it and succinctly for it by Donald Trump. And there were opportunities last night to do it. I don't want today to be a political day for him. Today, Donald Trump, it looks like he's in New York. He's just paying his respects. And that's what he should do today. He should just quietly pay his respects and then get back to the campaign trail tomorrow. But if we are going to never forget, then let's actually mean it. Let's not just say it, have our pretty hashtags, and move on. Either mean it or don't. And for millions of Americans, they don't actually mean it. And that is as disappointing as anything else.